Okay, so to conclude Unit 2, and again, you'll have your Unit 2 test on Wednesday or tomorrow. We're going to be talking about the first government in the United States, which was known as the Articles of Confederation, but then how it wasn't great, and basically how the first government was weak. And then because of that, we're going to try to fix things. So we're going to get together and have a little meeting, which we'll call the Constitutional Convention, and then examine what compromises came out of the Constitutional Convention. So again, you have this video, your guided notes. There's an ed puzzle on the Constitution, and then your mastery check. To prepare for your test, make sure you go over your guided notes. Look those over. What are some points of emphasis? Look over your I can statements, your lesson objectives. So for this lesson objective, as I just said, okay, looking at why the Articles of Confederation were the first government, explain their weaknesses, tell why it happened, and examine the important compromises. So Declaration of Independence is written, so now the revolution becomes a war for independence. When we win the war, we're going to be an independent nation, but we have to operate as a nation. If we're at war, we have to have some form of government to make our decisions. So after the Continental Congress adopts the Declaration, they agree that the colonies need to form this type of national government. So the Articles are introduced. So the Articles are adopted, which means they went into use in 1777. And in 1781, all the Articles are ratified. So, what type of government did the Articles create? So, remember, prior to the Revolution and the Revolution itself, people living in the colonies had two major concerns regarding what government was. They did not want a strong national central government. Their experience under the king obviously had not been a good one. There's also a concern over the states themselves. Some states are smaller than other larger states, so they didn't want some states to have more power than others in a national government. So the Articles address these concerns by forming a weak national government and giving each state one vote. So every state had the same power. So the Articles itself had only one branch of government, a legislature. So the definition of a legislature is a group of people meeting with the power of making laws for a nation or state. So the Confederation Congress was the name of the legislature under the Articles of Confederation. Each state got one vote, regardless of their population. So most states, if you're a larger state with a larger population, you had just as much power as a tiny state like Rhode Island or New Jersey than, say, Virginia and Massachusetts, which were the two largest states at the time. So most of the power in the decision making under this national government was left up to the states themselves. Things that the government could do. They could make treaties. This would be important because we're at war. We're going to have the Treaty of Paris. We could declare war. We could receive ambassadors from other countries, and we also could settle disputes between the states themselves. Things the government could not do: collect taxes from states or citizens, regulate trade, coin money, and enforce laws that they had passed. So I want you to pause the video here and think about what problems that might lead to for a country. If these are the things they could not do, what might some problems be that the government would see? Even though that the Articles were very weak, they did have a few accomplishments, a few good things. First, they win the American Revolution. They also successfully negotiate the Treaty of Paris. So remember on this map here on the right, you learned in the last lesson that the Treaty of Paris gave the United States all of this land in pink added onto the land they already had. So the other major accomplishment of the Articles was that with all of this new land that you see here, how are we going to set it up? Like, how are people going to move west? What are they going to get? How are they going to do that? So there's two laws that are passed: the Land Ordinance of 1785, which creates a system for that, It also established townships. So you'll see that on the next slide, what that looks like. And each township had to set aside one section for public education. So right off the bat, as a new nation, we decide that public education is going to be a really important thing for the United States of America. Okay. All right, so here's the idea of those townships, okay? So you see these little boxes. So basically, surveyors went out, surveyed areas in 6-mile squares. This is Ohio, which will be one of the first new states after Kentucky. And then if you look on this lower box, okay, section 16 would be reserved for school funds. So if you're familiar with states west of this area, many of our largest public universities and colleges are actually located on these township spaces. So Ohio State University would be an example of one. Penn State, a lot of these were kind of built and created because of these laws. The other law was the Northwest Ordinance, which set up how this new territory would eventually become a state and apply for statehood. The other thing that's interesting about the Northwest Ordinance is that it prohibited slavery, which means they were not allowed to have slavery in this striped region of the Northwest. So it's a rocky boat. We have lots of rough sailing ahead. The fact that we cannot coin money meant that every individual state was printing their own money. The fact we can't tax. So if you can't tax, you can't have an army or a navy or anything like that. And we don't have the power to enforce anything that's happening. So it fails. And the major event that leads to its failure happens, of course, in Massachusetts. A man named Daniel Shays was a farmer in Western Mass, not Worcester, Western, more near Springfield area. He led a rebellion. Him and his followers, the farmers, were very upset because Massachusetts had been passing very high taxes. When you don't pay a tax, you would get sent to debtor's prison, and they were foreclosing on the farms and homes of these men to pay the taxes. Many of the laws, well, all of the laws by the state are in Boston, where it's businessmen, it's a big, wealthy city. They don't know the experiences of the farmer life of Western Massachusetts. And Daniel Shays and many of these people were veterans. They had fought in the war. So they attempted to break into an arsenal in Springfield. One of the things they wanted to stop was you can't send people to prison if courts aren't open. So they were trying to shut down courthouses. So there was no way for the national government to do anything to stop this. So a small investor, a rich person living in Massachusetts, has to break this up, break up this rebellion. So this kind of revealed that the articles didn't work. The United States, while it might be nice to say we don't need a strong central government, we needed one. So that leads us to the Constitutional Convention. So 1787, it had become clear that the articles were ineffective. The convention meets, same building in Philadelphia where the Declaration of Independence had been drafted. Representatives from the 13 states originally show up saying, you know what, maybe this thing just needs some editing, fix some things, and then we almost decide immediately, throw the articles out, we need a whole new constitution. So who was there? Delegates came from 12 out of the 13 states. The only state not there was Rhode Island. They felt like something fishy was going on, so they didn't want to be a part of it. There's 55 delegates that arrive in total. George Washington is unanimously elected as the president of the convention. You have on the left-hand side James Madison. James Madison is a Virginia plantation owner. He becomes known as the father of the Constitution. He kept very detailed notes while he was there. So we basically know every conversation, every debate where everyone stood because he wrote everything down. And then he eventually will be the author later on of the Bill of Rights. Ben Franklin, we remember him from the Albany Plan of Union. He also was a signer of the Declaration. This is kind of his last rodeo. He's old. He's just there so people can like be polite and be like, we love you, Ben. But this is kind of his last time that he's in the public eye because he'll pass away shortly after this. So the first major issue is representation. Okay. The question is, should a larger state have more representation than a smaller state? So, should Massachusetts and Virginia have more of a say than Rhode Island, New Jersey, Georgia? We're thinking about population here. So, how is it determined under the articles? Remember, everyone was equal. So, two plans are proposed. We have the Virginia plan, which said we should have a federal system, which would have the national government and state government. Called for 3 branches. Remember, the articles only had 1 branch. So we would have the legislative, we would have an executive branch, and we would have a judicial branch. We would have 2 House legislature, and representation would be determined by the population. So that would give larger states much more population than smaller states. New Jersey did not like this. They were a small state. So they're like, we don't like that plan. We got our own plan. I'll take your 3 branches of government, but we're going to have 1 house and we're going to do the same thing we did under the articles where we each get all the same votes. So this is a problem. We're at an impasse. So what do you do when you can't decide? You compromise. You come together in the middle. So the convention voted, half voted for Virginia, half voted for New Jersey. So into the picture comes the guys from Connecticut. They put a plan together, basically taking ideas from the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan and smush them together, hoping that this will be the greatest compromise that ever happened. Their compromise was a 2-house legislature, an upper house, which we would call the Senate, would have equal representation for each state. The lower house, known as the House of Representatives, would be based on population. Today, we call this Congress. Congress equals the Senate and the House of Representatives together. The Great Compromise was approved by only 1 vote, and this is the system of government that we still have in place today. So the other issue that comes up is like, well, if we have something based on population, what do we do about all these slaves we have? Do we count them towards our population? Now, if I'm a small state and I have a lot of slaves, I'm going to say, yes, please, because that's going to give me more representation. But then there's also people there that are like, should we still have slaves? Should this still be legal? Which obviously the people that had slaves, like James Madison, are going to want to fight to keep slavery. So another compromise is needed, and this is called the 3/5 compromise. 3/5 of a state slave population would be counted when determining the number of representatives that each state could have. So the southern states were happy because they wanted more representation, and they have a lot of slaves. And then the North is also happy because they want the slaves, they're like, you're telling me these slaves are property. Well, property typically gets taxed. So we want them to count towards taxes too. So very controversial compromise that basically all of the slaves, all of whom were African Americans, were counted as 3/5 of a person, essentially. So under using the compromises, a final draft is made. The delegates have to return to their states to get enough votes for the Constitution to be approved. 19 out of the 13 states needed to ratify it for it to become the law of the land. So you have 2 groups. The Federalists, they believe the Constitution was where it was at and we need this. And then you also had a group like the Anti-Federalists. So we'll talk more about this in our next unit. But the big thing to focus on is the transition from the weak Articles of Confederation to the Constitution that is still in place today.